Alright, now we will create a Docker image for config server, as we did previously for the other microservice, Twitter to Kafka service. I will use Spring Boot Maven plugin with build image goal and specify the image name by prefixing it with project group ID and setting the version from the project version using project.version property. Then we need to add a config server definition to services YAML file. As you see, here I added a new service definition for config server with the config server image. I use group ID replacement variable, which comes from environment file, and use the service version again from the environment file. This image name is the name created by the Spring Boot Maven plugin. For the ports, I use 5006, which can be used for remote debugging. And you see in the Java opt environment variable, I set this port to open a port for remote debugging for this service. In the Java opts, I also set minimum and maximum JVM heap sizes, as you can see. I have a volume mapping here also to map the Docker logs folder to the logs folder inside the service, which is workspace config server logs for the config server microservice, which is created using build image goal of Spring Boot Maven plugin, and containers created with this build image goal has this log folder structure inside the container. I also passed the encrypt key environment variable in the environment section because it is required to decrypt the secrets at runtime. And finally, here I have the network definition, which uses global network from the environment file. As you see, both services, Twitter to Kafka service and config server, has the same network definition, so they can see each other. Now that we will run Twitter to Kafka service and config server together in a single compose file, what happens when the service tries to reach the config server and config server is not up yet? In that case, we need to set a health check to service and wait until config server is ready. There are some options like depends on the compose file definition. However, we need a more sophisticated approach to really check the health endpoint of config server, because depends on only checks if the container is up and running. Doesn't check if the application inside the container is really running. For that purpose, we will add a shell script and wait until config server actuator health endpoint return 200 response, which will indicate that config server started to running successfully. In the shell script, we will first run an update. Then install the curl command line utility. Then we will simply run a curl command against config server actuator health endpoint. And then we will extract the HTTP code. Then in a simple loop, we will check if we get correct response from the actuator health endpoint of config server. Otherwise, we will log to the console, sleep for 2 seconds, and retry the curl command. We will continue with this loop until we get correct response from config server. In the services YAML file, we will overwrite entry point for the Twitter to Kafka service and set this shell script that we created. To be able to run updates and also install the curl command in the shell script, we will run compose file with the user root. Then we want to continue launching our Spring Boot application, CMB Lifecycle Launcher, which is actually the original entry point. To reach the actuator health endpoint, we also need to add an exception to actuator path in the security config class of config server that we created in the previous sections. Now please stop the video and add an exception for actuator health endpoint for config server, so that we can call it from entry point shell script. Alright, we will just go to the security config class in config server module and add a line to add a ignoring match for actuator path. Here I want to set enable mock tweets to false, because I want to see real tweets on the console. One more thing to update in the Twitter to Kafka service definition in the services YAML file is to override the Spring Cloud config URI with the URL from the config server container. To be able to reach the config server, Twitter to Kafka service cannot use localhost anymore. It should use the hostname of the config server container, which is config-server here. And for the port, we will still use 8888. And also, we need to add encrypt key as an environment variable to the Twitter to Kafka service, as in the config server, because both of them requires this key to be able to decrypt the passwords. Then let's run maven install command with skipping the tests to be able to create the Docker image for config server, because the Docker image will be created in the maven install phase. As a final thing, we need to change the permission for the new shell script file. It should be a runnable file. So we run change mode +x for the check config server started sh file. Now since we have all the YAML file definitions in the compose_file variable in the environment file, we can simply run a docker compose up command to run all the containers. Let's first run the docker compose down command for the Kafka cluster, if you have it currently running. I have it running, so I am running this down command first. Then we can run the docker compose up command. If we run the docker ps command now, we will see the running containers. Let's get the container ID for Twitter to Kafka service and config server, and run docker logs -f command to follow the logs for both of them. As you can see in the Twitter to Kafka service, we see message config server is not up yet, but after config server is ready, it will continue to running. Now if we check the logs of Twitter to Kafka service, we will see the tweets that are sending to the Kafka topic. And if we check with the Kafka cat command line utility, we can actually see the Twitter topic has the tweets that are coming from a producer in the Twitter to Kafka service. I want to also show that we can actually connect to the running container using docker exec command. Just collect the ID of the container that you want to connect, and then run this command by specifying the shell that you want to run on that container. Then as you can see, you can run any Linux commands inside this container. And if we check the CMB lifecycle directory, we see the default entry point launcher here. You can run any commands inside this container and inspect the files and directories, as well as can monitor the container by running some Linux commands like top to see the memory and the CPU usage per task. Alright, good job so far. I will see you in the next section.